right, we're doing something a little bit different on the old pod today. We're doing an Ask Me Anything episode. I put out a call to arms on the email list a few days ago and got some questions back. And I figured I would pick 3 of them and go into a little bit of detail here, right? Kind of dig deep on these questions rather than just sort of throwing an answer out there and moving on. So we'll start with a question from Kim, which I'll read. So it says, since it seems like not only do you work a lot in the fitness forum and you personally enjoy working out, which is an assumption in parentheses, what keeps you motivated in the black hole, quote unquote, times? So I assume by black hole, the meaning there is when you are not motivated, not feeling good about exercise, burnt out on fitness, especially potentially as a fitness professional, etc. All those things could potentially contribute to feeling like you're stuck in some sort of black hole or approaching an event horizon thereof, which will just, slowly approach. And then once you cross it, it's over, you're done. So, I think the overall concept here essentially is related to motivation, right? What actually motivates you to train, and how do you keep doing it when you really don't want to? So I think this is applicable to a lot of people, not just fitness professionals, although I do think fitness professionals end up in sort of a unique spot here, since you are essentially all day helping other people exercise. You sort of see the psychological traps and foibles that they fall into, and then you yourself are hyper aware of these problems and then just succumb to the exact same things you see your clients doing, right? Where they're making excuses about not being able to train, letting their schedule get the best of them, not prioritizing their exercise, keeping junk food in the house, like all the stuff that you're like, here's how you don't do this. And then you just go and do the exact same thing. So I think that there's an additional layer of psychological trauma associated with that, where you're hyper aware of all the stuff that you're doing that you shouldn't be doing, and you're still doing it anyway. So that kind of makes you feel real bad and start to develop a little bit of self-hatred. So I think that's an extra layer, let's call it, to difficulty in motivating yourself as a fitness professional. But I don't think the overall concept is too terribly different for folks who work in the fitness industry, for folks who don't. But to sort of circle back to the concept of motivation, I think I've written and talked about this a few times, but in general, I think that motivation is a big, giant trap. It's a fake thing that really causes people a lot of trouble, since they're sort of waiting around trying to get motivated, hoping they get motivated, etc. I've said some pretty negative things about motivational quotes also, since I think that a lot of people like to, scroll through motivational quotes, look at them, have them on their browser background or on their phone background or whatever. And the concept there is sort of like, all right, I have to focus my mind, and I have to stay inspired to do all this stuff. And I really think that motivational quotes are, dare I say, a net negative for the world, since it gives people the feeling of doing something without actually doing something, right? It kind of scratches this itch of like, yeah, I could do this, I should do this, I will do this, but it's very lacking in actual substance. It's not strategic. It doesn't give you some sort of big picture idea of how you should accomplish what you're doing, nor is it tactical in terms of giving you a very specific action to take based upon a larger goal. So motivational quotes, I have a pretty bad attitude towards, although I think I did write this in an email newsletter recently. There is a possibility that people, some percentage of them, in this sort of funnel of people who might accomplish something, do need to experience something resembling motivation, like a recognition that they can do something that helps them sort of take power over their own situation and start taking action. But, once you take action, then the motivational quotes are no longer helpful. So in general, I think motivation is really not helpful for people. That what they need to do instead is figure out how to systemize what they're doing and make it work, right? So I will speak first from my personal experience, and then sort of dig into some concepts for people who are not necessarily wired like I am, since I know that I am a pretty extreme personality in some ways, and the specific tactics that I use for myself are really not helpful or relevant for a lot of people. So what I personally do, for me, again, kind of like I said, motivation doesn't really factor into things too much. I pretty much decide what I'm going to do, and then I do it, whether or not I'm motivated. And so, I have a coach who writes my training for me. I get it in a weekly email, which I have automatically set to parse and create a note in an Evernote notebook where I actually record my training, and I open it up and I just do it. So most things in my life are like this, right? This is characteristic of someone who is very high in the personality trait of conscientiousness, where pretty much anything that I decide to do becomes some sort of duty or obligation for me, and I create a system around it where a lot of the busy work happens automatically and then either ends up in some sort of schedule or to-do list, and it just happens. So I know for most people that's not terribly helpful. And, to sort of answer your question, like whether or not there's a black hole of motivation, it just doesn't matter. If I decide I'm going to do it and it's in my system, then it just happens. So for people who are kind of wired like that, more power to you. You probably don't need a lot of help getting yourself motivated to work out, since you just decide, you schedule it, you put it in an Asana project, you make a little weird thing that automates it and puts it in Evernote, and you get it done. For other people though, right, this is not the way most people operate. So I think that Gretchen Rubin's concept of the 4 tendencies is very helpful here, which I think is really just a sort of a derivation of more standard like 5-factor personality models. But if you guys haven't seen Gretchen Rubin's stuff on the 4 tendencies, I would definitely recommend it. I think it's a pretty accessible book and just sort of like concepts surrounding different types of personalities, and can give you a lot of insight into how and why other people do things or why they don't, right? Since I think a lot of people have some frustration either with themselves or others for just really not getting stuff done that they say they're going to do or that they say they want to do. So without kind of digging too deeply into Gretchen's model here, or my thoughts on it surrounding how it relates to 5-factor models of personality, meaning openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, we'll just say that there's a few different types that respond to different things in order to get them to actually do stuff, right? So again, for someone like myself who's high in conscientiousness, excuse me, the way things work is you decide to do it and you develop some sort of weird discipline and system around it, and then you make it happen. And the danger for this type of person is much more that their system becomes like too rigid and weird, and then they start doing stuff that is counterproductive for themselves, right? So overtraining or being inflexible in their workout schedule and like making weird sacrifices that aren't relevant in order to get something done on their to-do list they made themselves, or accomplish their weird training homework that they've given themselves that just really isn't actually relevant to what they're trying to do, right? So that's sort of the personality type that I fall into. For other people, something like accountability is very, very important, right? Having some sort of group that they feel a part of is hugely relevant to getting them to train. So for some people, motivation comes from actually being excited to be around others and, sort of suffer in a group environment, and then also just the expectation of other people that you will be there, right? So something like a group class or a personal training session, or even just having friends who are your workout buddies, feeling that obligation of like, okay, if I don't go to this, I will let these other people down. That is a huge factor for just getting people to show up, right? Because I think that for a lot of this stuff, especially with training, if you show up, you will feel better and you will feel good about it once you've actually started to exercise, right? I experience this all the time where, I usually train in the middle of the afternoon, sometime in like the 2 p.m. window, which is typically not a time of very high energy. And I often don't want to work out at all. I have no desire to do it, but I know that as soon as I actually start doing it, that I will feel good and I will be fine. So, the same thing happens for people who don't want to train, and then they have an obligation to, again, meet up with some friends or a coach or go to a group class. And then once they're there, the rest is kind of taken care of for them. It's like, okay, you got over that first hurdle, and now you're able to get it done. For other folks, something about an identity level commitment to training might be very helpful, that they don't do well with specific schedules or to-do lists or anything like that. That kind of feels like oppressive and restrictive. And for these people, they often do much better sort of thinking of themselves as the type of person who accomplishes, exercise, right? Like, I'm an athlete. This is what I do. I'm someone who cares about my health and fitness. This is what I do. I'm a leader in my business, and I demonstrate that I can push myself both physically and mentally. This is what I do, right? So that type of identity level understanding of how fitness relates to who you are as a person can be very motivating for other people. And again, these types of individuals often don't do well with like the more specific structure and scheduling types of tips. But once they make a commitment that to themselves as like, this is who I am, they're able to sort of figure out how to get it done. And then the other sort of archetype is the questioner archetype in Gretchen Rubin's framework. And for this person, once they're sort of convinced of why something matters, then they behave much more like me, right? So that person, especially if they're in the fitness industry, often just needs a lot of information and someone who they trust, right? So I think that this type of person can actually do well with a coach, although they might occasionally drive that coach nuts by questioning the programming or pushing back on stuff or kind of giving the coach a hard time. But if you have someone who you trust, who you buy into, this type of person can do really, really well, because once they're given the assignment from a trusted source, they'll just kind of execute it. It's like, all right, here's my program, I'll get it done. I've definitely had some clients like that have given me a little bit of a hard time and have a lot of questions all the time. And, actually understanding their sort of mindset and the framework that they're coming from has definitely helped me as a coach sort of not get as frustrated with them, where I'm like, it's just, this is a good idea. This is why you should do it. I do much better actually explaining stuff to them and kind of giving them the information that they need to feel like they are actually making a good decision, right? So to kind of circle back to that big picture concept of motivation, I think that I don't love the idea of motivation, but I do think that understanding the type of person that you are and what is the type of thing that will actually get you to commit to exercising is going to be one of the highest leverage activities here, especially, again, using this phrase, the black hole times, where, I assume stuff isn't going well, training isn't going well, et cetera. So that's from a personality perspective. I also think that there's a few other pieces that matter here, right? So Dan John is a relatively well-known strength and conditioning coach who has a lot of, I don't know what the right word is here. How about folk wisdom surrounding strength and conditioning? He has some pretty good books and a lot of articles on T Nation that really just kind of cut to the heart of a lot of matters of strength and conditioning and cut through a lot of fluff, right? He's pretty impatient with a lot of the technical details and weird lines of questioning that people get into, especially for folks who, aren't necessarily competing in a sport where they really need to be the absolute, tip top 99.99th percentile in terms of what they're accomplishing as far as their training and everything like that. So especially for people who just want to work out, look good, feel good, have fun, etc., that folks get really wrapped up in weird details that aren't terribly helpful for them. So one of the concepts that Dan John has put out there, which kind of confused me at first, I just didn't really understand his terminology until I sort of went back and read the one of the articles in which he mentioned it. But he has a concept of park bench workouts and bus stop bench workouts, right? So the idea here is essentially that if you are sitting on a park bench, you don't necessarily have somewhere to be, right? You're not having expectations surrounding what's going to go on. You're really just at the park, looking at trees or dogs or someone playing Frisbee, hopefully enjoying some sun. Maybe you put on some sunblock if you have a family history of skin cancer, all this stuff that goes on at the park bench, but you're not really attached to any sort of outcome, right? Whereas if you're sitting on a bench at a bus stop, you have an expectation of when the bus is coming, right? You potentially have an app tracking the next arriving bus. You have somewhere that you need to be at a specific time. And if the bus isn't coming, you're getting impatient, you're getting upset, and you're really sitting there not to, enjoy the sun and passersby and people playing sports. You're sitting there because you have something to do. And so this concept of park bench versus bus stop bench workouts, I think, is pretty relevant for folks in the fitness industry also, right? That, again, the people who are competitive, who are trying to qualify for something in CrossFit or, make some sort of team or whatever, right? Those folks need to spend a lot more of their time training with a very specific purpose, and they need to be focused on having specific outcomes occur. Whereas other people who don't necessarily have specific goals like that can spend a lot more of their time training in sort of like a park bench state, right? The goal in and of itself is to train, that you will accomplish more over time by spending a lot of time training without having a ton of attachment to outcome, and then occasionally having periods of time where you are really focused on, increasing your squat or improving your conditioning or something like that, than you will from really feeling like you need to push yourself all the time. So I think that it can be relevant, especially as a fitness professional, to give yourself permission to just train and not really focus on having a specific outcome. And that, I think that can be difficult for people, especially in the fitness industry, because often folks who are in the fitness industry have some sort of background in competitive sport. I know in CrossFit, a lot of people at one point maybe were competitive, at least in their local area, or maybe qualified for some events at some point. And a lot of those folks just don't really have that same ambition anymore, especially with the restructuring of the competitive CrossFit season. But, the goal for people isn't necessarily to hit some specific numbers anymore. And that can be difficult because if you're used to being in that very outcome focused training environment, you always have something that you're shooting for. And then when you're kind of past that in terms of your ability to commit to training, maybe you've accumulated injuries, maybe your priorities are just working on a business or career or family or something like that. You don't have the same bandwidth to focus on adaptation, or you're just older, you're just not going to hit numbers that you used to be able to hit. And I know I'm certainly in that situation, right? I mean, I had a wrist injury, had some wrist surgery. I run some businesses that take up a huge amount of my bandwidth, and I just know I will not ever be as good of an athlete as I once was in a lot of ways. And so that can be challenging, right? You're just like, well, I will literally never hit the same number for a power clean that I hit a few years ago. And that can be challenging, right? But I think that the concept of giving yourself permission to have park bench workouts rather than bus stop bench workouts can be really, really huge there, because a lot of the negative self-talk that comes, I guess that becomes a barrier to people, comes from this focus on outcome and this sort of self-judgment and feeling like you're a failure and all that kind of stuff, right? That is a pretty surefire path to an all or nothing mentality that results in people not getting stuff done because they're not going to be able to do it perfectly, or they're not going to be able to hit numbers that they used to hit, or they're not going to be able to follow their training program. So figuring out how to really relax and give yourself permission to not have a specific outcome that you need. And then honestly, also, I think that the other aspect there too is giving yourself permission to do something that's maybe not exactly what you were planning on doing, or have a plan B, et cetera, right? That I guess this can be a little bit of a slippery slope, since people will start to negotiate with themselves and talk themselves out of training or not doing what they know they should do because they don't feel like doing it. And that's not really what I mean by that, but making it so that you have something that you can do as a plan B that will keep you consistent is very, very relevant for people here too, right? That, you may have this perfect training session planned out. It's an hour and a half long. It's got part A1, A2, A3, B1, B2, B3, C, D, E, and F. And you're like, all right, this is going to be awesome. But come that day, you didn't sleep well the previous night, or you have some meeting that goes over, or some client reschedules or something. It just, it turns into a mess, and you don't have the bandwidth to get that full training session done. That giving yourself permission in that state then to say, all right, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do, here's my plan B workout. It's a 20-minute EMOM of all this different stuff. And you know that you can get it in, and that's better than nothing, right? So I think that giving yourself permission to modify based upon that, but not necessarily permission to always negotiate yourself out of doing what you know you should be doing, is another huge part there, right? That this focus on perfection becomes pretty, damaging for people, particularly fitness professionals who can be, a little bit wound tight about how exactly they train. The final piece here is just the concept of like time management and priority management, right? A lot of this stuff is cliches that show up a lot in various circles of self-development and business development, but I do think there's a lot of truth to these, right? That someone who says that they don't have time to train just really means that it's not a priority for them. So figuring out why training maybe should be a priority for you, like what does it actually accomplish for you, right? We talked about some stuff earlier about identifying as a certain type of person. Maybe for you, your specific performance isn't as important now, but you maybe want to demonstrate a good example to your clients. You want to learn about yourself through physical challenge. You want to stay healthy long-term. You want to have better focus throughout the day. You want to have better sleep. That all these things are potential ways that you can motivate yourself to train by really just saying, you know what, this is a priority for me for these various reasons. So, saying you don't have time just means it's not a priority. So you got to figure out why it might be a priority. And then the other aspect that's another major cliche, but pretty relevant, is just this concept of managing energy, not time, right? That people often say they don't have time for stuff, but what they really mean is they don't have energy as far as the mental bandwidth to make themselves do something or the sort of focus necessary to get something done. So we talked earlier about my own schedule where I almost purposely shove my training into a pretty low energy time of day, which is absolutely not optimal for my exercise. But I do it on purpose because I care more about accomplishing other aspects of my work than my exercise. So I want to use my sort of like peak focus times to get stuff done. But you may find that if you're having a hard time getting your training done, that you may need to shift your schedule around to put it in a time when you potentially feel better actually exercising. And that might make it more fun for you and help with some of that, I guess, black holeness that we're talking about. So hopefully that was helpful. Kind of a lot of stuff in there. And feel free to shoot over any follow-up questions or comments on that. Please also send me all of your favorite inspirational quotes, since I love them so much. Okay, so next question. This one comes from Danielle. So rather than read the whole thing, it's kind of a paragraph or too long here. Really, the question comes down to how do you teach coaches to make modifications or scaling for older or less fit athletes? And the overall concept here is that a lot of coaches are comfortable kind of like modifying stuff for competitive athletes or folks who are pretty fit, but may struggle to actually set things up properly for clients who are not sort of like the standard mold of like an athletic CrossFitter. So I think this is a really good question. And honestly, I think that this is something that I personally am struggling with a lot, right? So I know a lot of our coaches listen to this podcast at South Loop. So apologies if you feel like I'm putting you guys on blast here, but I know that I personally have a lot of frustration as far as like teaching coaches how to do certain things. So this is something I'm really working on and trying to figure out is how to best sort of like impart knowledge upon others such that it's actually actionable. I feel pretty comfortable, obviously, just talking about something that I find interesting, making an outline of something, rambling, putting up a bunch of points, bullet points, etc. But actually getting that to result in behavior change or better understanding for other people is just shockingly difficult. And it's something that I'm, again, pretty frustrated by, and I don't really know what the best path forward is here. And this is something I've been working on a lot as far as how we run our coaches meetings, et cetera. So I guess I'll give you a few different layers of answer here, right? I figure I can talk about how we actually do attempt to train and teach our coaches stuff, and then sort of a more detailed discussion on the actual concept of scaling and modifying different workouts or positions. So as far as training coaches go, again, I've sort of over the years of working with coaches learned that simply talking about information or presenting information as far as like podcasts, articles, etc., just really doesn't do a whole lot in terms of getting people to do things differently, which is interesting for me, right? Because almost everything that I've learned or put into practice as a coach is something that I picked up from watching videos, going to seminars, etc., right? Definitely some stuff from coaches that I've seen them do in person, but I haven't necessarily been in a lot of positions where I'm getting like one-on-one in-person mentorship from someone in terms of how to do things. That it's mostly information that's actually pulled from external sources or sort of like formal continuing education. So the fact that that has worked for me and just doesn't work at all for other people is very interesting to me and something that I'm sort of struggling to figure out. So what I think really needs to happen is that people need to feel like they are solving a problem, right? That people are constantly in search of solutions to their problems, but that if they don't feel like they're solving a problem that they have, a lot of information to them is just kind of like intellectual entertainment that won't actually change how they behave or potentially update habits. So something that we've really been thinking about is how do we actually create scenarios in which coaches have to actually problem solve and potentially use or learn new information, which then hopefully gets integrated and then they're able to actually use the stuff that they've learned in real life scenarios. So for our coaches meetings, we've really changed the structure of it. So rather than having, I guess, more like lecture based continuing education stuff where I potentially, bring something to the table and go up there and write some stuff down, or some other coach presents on a concept, we tried to have more case study style situations. So as far as scaling stuff, right? So for example, we've done several case studies now where we create an avatar of a client who may come in and ask a specific type of question or who has a certain issue, and then we sort of have the coaches chop up what they would do in a specific scenario. So to give you an example, we had a case study based on a real client who had some back pain, history of back injuries, and was in our CrossFit classes. And was actually sensitive to rotation, right? So they weren't really sensitive to hinging or squatting or anything like that, but any rotational type of movement was pretty painful and potentially dangerous for them. So, we had the coaches talk through a workout that we had written on the board and had them ask the questions of the client until they figured out what was potentially a dangerous movement for them, right? And it was sort of set up to be a little bit tricky because in this case, the dangerous movement for the client was a box step up loaded with dumbbells, right? Because they were missing hip flexion and had some sensitivity to rotation in the lower back. So a box step up puts them in a lot of hip flexion, which they don't really have. And they end up kind of like twisting to get away from it and sort of like swinging their leg up, which is really not a good situation for someone who is potentially at injury risk if they're rotating through the low back. So creating scenarios like that where coaches have to really reason through stuff and put all the stuff that they have learned into practice, and then hopefully just try to put them in a situation where they're like, oh wow, okay, I either know this or there's pretty obvious gaps in my knowledge in terms of my ability to figure this stuff out, is hopefully a productive and helpful way to actually create learning rather than just, here's some information, hopefully you do something about it. So yeah, we do the case studies. We also do a lot of film review. So we have coaches bring in film and, we watch film of someone screwing up a snatch or a clean or a pistol or a handstand or whatever. And then we talk about it, right? We talk about, okay, what do you actually see here? What is the major issue? Because a lot of stuff with these types of issues is really understanding what the major thing is that's going on rather than just the stuff that you're seeing, right? Okay, yeah, you see that they have like some sort of weird stance, but what is the actual issue? Is the issue their stance, or is the issue that they have restrictions in their hip mobility, which then causes them to adopt this bizarre stance because that's the only way that they can actually create the range of motion that they understand that they should be creating in order to squat. So we try to really dig into that kind of stuff. And I'm sure that, there's some frustration with the type of Socratic questioning that comes with this, where, we watch the video and then sort of go around and say, all right, well, what do you see? And okay, what do you think about that? Is there anything else that you could see there? What would you say to this person? What do you think that they would tell you? Have you ever seen anyone else do this kind of stuff, right? So I kind of try to, push buttons there and make folks reason it through as much as possible before just giving them an answer. Although that does often end up being part of it, right? Because I often am seeing something that I'm trying to extract from the coaches and doesn't always get there. So I do probably jump in a little more than I should and kind of give them a breakdown of what I'm seeing and why I think it is actually happening that way. And the other aspect of it as well is really working on developing exercise programming, right? So a lot of coaches do have personal training clients or clients who they work with one-on-one. But I really want coaches as a whole to have a much deeper and better understanding of the point behind different exercise selection, progressions in training, why we set things up a certain way, why we potentially, do a back squat instead of a front squat, why we actually may follow, a handstand push up with a Turkish get up. Like, what are we actually trying to do there? All that sort of stuff. So we've spent a lot of time working on actually digging into and explaining programming. So we'll do that as a practical, right? All right, like explain Wednesday's programming, give us the rundown as if we were your class, or just sort of ask more detailed questions in terms of why things are set up the way they are. Then we've also worked as a group on actually writing days of training, which I think, again, when you're actually writing the training, it's totally different than just sort of looking at it and taking it in. You have to have a much deeper understanding of why you might do certain things to create workouts, and that hopefully that type of reasoning through, why would we do this? How long is this going to take? Is the entire group going to be able to do this? How will this work logistically? Is the coach going to be able to explain this properly, or will it be too confusing? That all that sort of stuff hopefully puts people in a position where they really have to think things through and figure out what's actually going on. So as far as like training coaches, that's what I've seen as being more effective. And it's honestly a huge work in progress. I think this is one of the the most important things that I'm trying to figure out, and I don't feel like I have a 100% great answer here as far as how to do it, but I think that we are at least on the right track. I did recently read a book that recommended another book called Make It Stick, which has to do with actually helping coaches retain information. Well, not just coaches, but people, right? If you teach someone something, how do you actually make it stick? So I will actually be prioritizing that in my own personal reading list soon. So hopefully there's some good insight there. One of the things from the book that I read, which is called The Coaching Habit, which is a relatively short book, kind of a conglomeration of a lot of different ideas from various thinkers and TED talkers and all that kind of stuff, which I thought was relatively actionable. It gave some pretty good questions to ask people in different types of situations, although the book itself was a little frustrating for me because, again, it's like, okay, if you've seen the top 20 TED Talks, you probably have seen a lot of these concepts already, but it sort of distills it down into very specific questions you can ask people. So one that I do think is helpful is, what was the most helpful part for you of what we just talked about? And that's something I've been trying to implement, since it kind of forces a reflection moment where people actually have to process what they've been taught and repeat it back without just sort of saying, oh yeah, that was really interesting. Cool. I guess I'll just go do exactly what I've been doing. So in order to actually scale stuff, right? So that's the discussion on actually training coaches. We're talking this concept of scaling and modification specific to a CrossFit group class, right? So I do think that for people who may have specific movement issues or training issues, et cetera, that an individualized program is always an option that may be better, right? So if someone is, in this case, older or may have injuries or may not be able to tolerate the volume and intensity of like a CrossFit group class, that actually working one-on-one with a coach may be a better option. Although I do recognize that some people, they just don't want to do it, right? They want to come to a class and they want to have fun with their friends, and getting them to train on their own is not always going to be viable. So I do understand that there's a trade-off there, but this type of individual, I may, push more toward doing one-on-one training, since they are going to be able to get that specific prescription for them that is going to be helpful. All that said, to really understand scaling and modification, I usually think of this in a few different buckets. So we're sort of looking at, okay, what is the movement pattern that we're talking about training here? What is the energy system that we're talking about training? And then, for a specific client, how much volume and intensity is necessary for them to actually get a stimulus? So if we kind of break those pieces down for a specific client who is potentially older or less fit, we're thinking about number one, okay, what is the volume and intensity that they need? And for this type of client, I'm probably looking more to get a minimum effective dose than like a maximum tolerable dose, right? So if we think about a situation where we have a competitive athlete who is training, we're generally looking to give that individual something close to a maximum tolerable dose of training, right? If they're like, okay, I want to get as good as I can possibly be, we kind of want to push right up to that line of how much training they can handle and then back off from that. So we want to sort of push them right to the edge and really see, okay, how much can you adapt to? Great, you're still adapting. Cool, let's give you a little more. Great, still adapting. Let's give you a little bit more. And for that individual, that's okay. That's sort of the game that they've signed up to play. So, for those folks, that's really what we want to do, and we understand we're kind of playing with fire with that, right? That we may get some injuries, we may get some bumps and bruises along the way. We may sort of push into a state resembling overtraining, but they signed up to try to win, and that's kind of what comes with that process. Whereas for, again, other clients who are, especially older or a little bit deconditioned, and who don't necessarily have specific competitive goals, that we're thinking much more, what is the minimum effective dose of training that you need to actually get the results that you want, right? And for a lot of people, that's less than they think it is. That people think that they need to do stuff that's really hard in order to actually get results, right? It's like, okay, if I don't, crawl out of the gym, if I'm not rolling around on the ground after a workout, I didn't actually accomplish anything. And that's really just not the case. I think that's a pretty dangerous myth within the fitness industry and the CrossFit community, is that, you can get a lot of results without having to layer on that much volume and intensity. So for this type of client, we're really trying to think about what is going to keep you in the gym consistently for the course of 3 to 6 months, and what is the actual dose that you need to get an adaptation. Especially, again, if you're a bit older or a little bit deconditioned, that dose that you need to get an adaptation is just really probably way less than you think it is. So that would be one thing I would be thinking about is, okay, with this training session, can we actually reduce the number of repetitions? Can we reduce the amount of load that you're going to be put under? And how often are you actually hitting a session with either high volume or high intensity? And is that an appropriate amount of times per week or whatever for you relative to where you're at and what you're trying to accomplish? So that would kind of be a starting point. And then as far as like more specific modifications, let's say we have a situation where we're doing, I don't know, for training today, we did back squats into bent over dumbbell rows into dumbbell presses, right? 4 sets of each, and it was like a short rest in between them. The back squat was a little bit heavy. The other pieces were a little bit lighter with higher repetition. So let's say we're dealing with someone who may potentially have some sort of knee injury, and they really are not going to do particularly well with squatting, right? So, okay, well, number one, what is the movement pattern here, and how can we modify it, right? So say squatting is going to bother their knee. Do we want to try to squat them? Yes or no, right? And those types of questions are going to come from speaking to the client. What's going on with your knee? What's the issue here? Is this something that's chronic? Is this something that's acute? Have you seen a physical therapist or a doctor for it? Do you have a diagnosis? Is it a sharp pain? Is it a dull pain? Do you get nerve pain? Does the joint click or hitch? Like all these types of questions, it can sort of give an idea of how potentially serious this is and sort of where they're at with this injury, right? So provided this is something that is relatively minor or they may be cleared for activity, but it's kind of bothering them a little bit, we may attempt to do some sort of squatting motion and just modify it such that they're not going to actually be in pain, right? So if that's the case, we can do something like a box squat where they pause on the box and keep the shin vertical. That could be an option. We could do some sort of modified squatting, right? They might not do particularly well with, let's say, a barbell squat, but maybe they can do a variation of that with kettlebells or something like that feels okay for them. So these are all ideas that we can sort of play with, right? And a lot of this is going to be based upon feedback from the client and what they feel comfortable with and what we can do to keep them out of pain. If the squatting motion is still painful on the knee, we may decide to switch to some sort of single leg variation, right? We can do a single leg knee dominant movement. So, can we do a box step up on the good leg? Can we do a lunge on the good leg? Can we do maybe some sort of lateral squatting movement such that we're not loading that knee so that it's painful? If these are all also painful, then we're going to sort of look at, okay, well, maybe we need to avoid this like knee dominant movement altogether. What about something that is still lower body focused, but has much less knee flexion? And start to look into something more focused on hinging or deadlifting, right? So, all right, what about an RDL? What about a kettlebell swing? What about a deadlift, etc.? And then, based upon that, we can hopefully find some sort of movement pattern that is potentially not irritating to the knee. If the deadlifting and hinging isn't working, what if we do some sort of like dragging or pushing movement? Can you push a sled? Can you drag a sled? Can you drag a sled backwards? Can we just load you with something like a barbell in a back rack position? Are any of these options? So that's kind of the type of thought process I would go through. Charlie Weingroff has a concept called lateralizations and regressions that I think is really, really helpful here as far as regression sort of being moving up or down the same movement pattern, right? So if you think of that sort of being like a vertical movement up or down from like, I don't know, let's call it a front squat. We could also do a double kettlebell front squat. We could do a back squat. We could do a safety bar squat. These are all squatting movements, but we can also sort of lateralize into a different like movement, whatever hierarchy. We can sort of lateralize over to deadlifting or single leg stuff or some sort of pushing motion with a sled, right? That's all stuff that is training similar muscle groups but in a slightly different movement pattern. So that's sort of how I would approach the movement pattern concept here. Then once we have that figured out, we might want to move on to understanding what the actual energy system stimulus is here, right? So if we're dealing with something that is a heavy back squat, we're really thinking about, okay, how can we get really intense contractions, extreme tension, all that type of stuff, right? So, if a heavy back squat is not going to work, we might not be able to get the same type of stimulus by doing a dumbbell step up, right? So, okay, well, what can we do instead? Maybe we want to deadlift, right? The deadlifting may more closely resemble the overall strength-based stimulus of that heavy squat than some sort of single leg variation. And if that's the case, then that might be what we need to push into. If for example, we are doing something that's more high repetition, let's say we're doing like a double kettlebell front squat, and that is not really feeling good, then we may be able to get a similar type of stimulus with something like a wall ball. Maybe a wall ball feels okay, but the double kettlebell front squat doesn't. Or in that case, maybe a kettlebell swing, right? We're trying to get that same feeling of, right, we're doing high repetitions. There's maybe a little bit of tension, but it's not terribly grindy. We're kind of like getting out of breath as we do it. So we're just really thinking about what does doing this movement feel like, and then based upon that, we can actually attempt to adjust the movement to recreate that same stimulus, right? So thinking about what is the actual volume and intensity that this individual needs, what movement patterns can they do that don't actually create pain or potential exacerbation of injury, and then what type of energy system are we actually training here? What does this training session feel like, and how do we recreate that, right? So whether or not the person is injured or deconditioned or older, we're really just looking at, using those concepts to modify stuff. And I guess the other piece that's worth mentioning here is that especially for some older individuals, we may not need to hit something that is like a truly heavy single. We may not need to hit something that is like a true, really uncomfortable 30-second sprint effort on an assault bike. That just may not be relevant. And if that's the case too, then we can easily modify that as well and say, okay, well, you know what? It's not appropriate for you to be really trying to dig down the rabbit hole of energy system discomfort on assault bike and burpees, but understanding pacing and all that kind of stuff is relevant. So rather than doing this 30-second sprint at near all-out pace, here's what you're going to do. You're going to do 1 minute on, 1 minute off of 10 assault bike calories, 10 Russian kettlebell swings, and that's hopefully going to be something that's a little bit more, like in alignment with your goals and your sort of capacity to tolerate and recover from training. So that would be the framework I would use to actually modify stuff for folks. And then, again, teaching people to reason through that stuff is really, really hard. And I'm trying to come up with ways to deliver the information, not just as far as, here's the concepts and the theories that you need to know, but how do you actually put that into place when you are going to be coaching in real life? So 2 questions, about 40 minutes. That's where I thought I was going to be. I was going to tackle one more, but the battery on my computer is just about dead, and I don't have my charger cable nearby. So there you go. Another nice amateur move from my podcast. We'll leave this at about 40 minutes here. Hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully you guys liked actually kind of taking a deep dive on these questions rather than just sort of like rapid fire answers on some other pieces. If you guys read my long emails, hopefully you're on board with some dense information here. We might do this again if this goes well for people. So let me know what you think of it. Also, shoot me over an email reply next time I send something out, and let me know if you thought this was actually helpful. And great, I will talk to you guys soon. Thanks for listening all the way through. I admire your grit, your persistence, and your perseverance. Since you made it, I have a few favors to ask of you. Go ahead and open up the show notes on whatever podcast player you use. In there, you'll find links to all the resources that were mentioned throughout the show. There's also some links there in which you can leave a review or subscribe to the show. And podcasters are always harping on this because this actually makes a difference in terms of the algorithms that recommend podcasts to new people. So if you do that, it helps more people find the show. And if you head over to toddneef.com, you can sign up to receive most of my thoughts and writing, which really only go out to the email list. A lot of it never makes it to the blog or the podcast. So if you like what I have to say and you want to see some of my recommendations and stuff that I've been checking out, go ahead and subscribe to that email newsletter as well.